What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to my three-part video tutorial series on how to paint Colossus from Marvel Crisis Protocol. This third video covers painting the rest of Colossus, so we're looking at his red and yellow suit, the gold belt and belt buckle, and then the Sentinel Arm, along with a final airbrush nuancing pass, and then weathering patterns. To paint the purple Sentinel head armor, use AK Amethyst Blue, Scale Colors Sunset Purple, AK Deep Purple, and then to paint the blue armor on the Sentinel Arm, using AK Dark Sea Blue, Light Prussian Blue, Aquatic Turquoise, and Scale Colors Pale Skin. To paint the non-metal metal on the Sentinel head and arm, we're using AK's Dark Sea Blue, Gray Blue, Spectrum Blue, and Greenish White. To paint the red suit, using AK Tenebris Gray, Burnt Red, and Blood Red. Paint the yellow portion of the suit using Scale Colors Indian Shadow, Sahara Yellow, Canary Yellow, Vallejo Game Ink Yellow, AK Yellow, and Pastel Yellow. To paint the non-metal gold on the belt, using AK Tenebris Gray, Vallejo Burnt Umber, English Uniform, Japanese Uniform World War II, and Ivory. To paint the black belt buckle, as well as some of the cabling on the Sentinel Arm, we're using AK Black, Rubber Black, and Scale Colors Hellbound Flesh. Glazes are applied over the entire model with Vallejo Game Air's Hexed Lichen. A 50-50 mix of Vallejo Pigments Burnt Umber and Dark Yellow Ochre are applied to the base and a little bit of the feet to add a bit more environmental dust and effects. To paint the red of the suit, we're going to be using three colors: AK Tenebris Gray, Burnt Red, and Blood Red. We're going to start with a base coat of 50-50 Tenebris Gray and Burnt Red, and we're going to apply this over all of the red areas, making sure that we get into the insets where the red meets the yellow, and being very neat when we get to the edge of the suit where we meet the non-metal metal. Make sure that we get the inset of the belt as well as the X on the buckle. And from the base coat of that Tenebris Gray Burnt Red mix, we're going to work quickly into the Burnt Red. Now, pure Burnt Red, you can see, is fairly bright in value, much like when painting the non-metal metal though. What I'm going to do is quickly block in my placement of where I want my highlights to go, and then I'll use some intermediary mixes of the Burnt Red and Tenebris Gray to transition the colors and blend them together, like so. These are fairly easy, fairly forgiving colors to work with, and they cover very, very well. So this is going to go much quicker than doing the metallic objects. When you get to the torso, make sure that you will highlight according to the muscle forms and line up with what we've already painted on the metallic objects. Make sure that you carry that consistent highlight stroke across, and bear that in mind as well when we get into the yellow. And once we've built the red up to Burnt Red, we're going to keep working our way up into Blood Red. The jump from Burnt Red to Blood Red is fairly significant. Blood Red right here is a very bright color. And so you're going to want to do a lot of intermediary steps, a lot of mixing. If you want, you can pick up some of AK's intermediary colors to build up your red, as opposed to mixing it on the palette. But I find these colors mix together very, very well. And we're just going to keep working up the red up into pure Blood Red. To get that nice contrast, make sure that when you get right up into the brightest highlights, we're focusing mainly on the shoulders, the chest, the gauntlets, the top of the knees. Get that nice shift between your midtones and your bright tones, your midtones, and your dark tones. Don't highlight the red uniform all the way around. Get some nice contrast in there. To paint the yellow stripe running down the front and back of Colossus's uniform, we're going to start with 3 colors to build up sort of a ready ochre color. That's Scale Colors Indian Shadow, Sahara Yellow, and Tenaire Yellow. And the reason we're using these colors is because they build up more easily on black. Much easier paints to work with in terms of opacity on the model. And what we can do is we can use this to establish our initial values, on top of which we can then do a glaze of game ink yellow or some other very saturated yellow ink sort of color. Pump up the saturation before we go back in with some yellow and white paints to finalize our highlights. So I'm going to start with a base coat of a 50-50 mix of Indian Shadow and Sahara Yellow. I'm going to apply a nice even base coat over the entire yellow portion, making sure to leave the insets in a deep tenuous gray color. You'll want to do a couple of passes of this, make sure you get a nice even base coat. Once we've got our base coat down, we're going to work up through into pure Sahara Yellow, and then up into pure Tenaire Yellow. We're going to highlight the musculature like we would any other sort of skin-tight suit. We want to make sure that we connect all the muscles and also carry the highlights over from the red portion of the suit. Part of making it like a convincing two-tone suit or a suit with a two-tone pattern is to make sure that your highlights are consistent throughout. Despite the sculpt having the yellow and red portions separated by an engraved divider, really this is one suit with a yellow stripe down the middle. All one fabric, and so the highlights should not be different between the different elements of it. And as we're highlighting up into the Tenaire Yellow, you want to make sure that you are really ramping up the contrast and values from the darks, from your base coat into your highlights. The game ink yellow has a tendency to knock the value back of whatever it's glazed on top of. And your pure Tenaire Yellow, even though it's a fairly bright white ochre, once the yellow gets glazed on top, it becomes more of a mid-tone yellow. So be very careful to push your values, make sure you've got some dark darks and bright brights, so that by the time we get to that glazing of the yellow ink, we're not going to lose all of our shading. And we want to keep working our highlights into that pure Tenaire Yellow. Don't worry if your blends at this stage are a little bit rough. The game ink yellow will soften everything up, so do the best you can to keep it smooth, but if it's not perfect, not a big deal. Focus more on the general forms and getting your values right and not necessarily on technical execution. You also want to make sure that you're leaving some of that Indian Shadow, Sahara Yellow mix in your midtones and shadows. When the game ink yellow glazes over it, those specific colors creates a very lovely sort of an orangey red color. So try and make sure that all of your yellow isn't just Sahara Yellow or Tenaire Yellow. Try and maintain some of that Indian Shadow. Our values blocked in with this ochre sort of recipe. We're going to take our Vallejo Game ink yellow. We're not going to really dilute it. We're just going to have some of that moisture from the mud palette, but more or less using the color straight out of the pot. And we're going to gently glaze over the yellow. And you can see that it's already shifting that saturation really into an orangey yellow. It turns this ochre into this lovely, rich color with a whole lot of effort. Now, with one pass, pure Tenere yellow with a glaze of the yellow ink is almost the same, just a touch darker than AK's yellow. So this will form a brilliant starting point for us to then continue highlighting up with AK yellow and pastel yellow. And you see how in those really deep shadows where we have a lot more of that African shadow or Indian shadow showing through, it really starts to take on an orangey yellow tone. Get some nice rich shadows with this recipe. Make sure you're very careful in your glazing. Don't overpaint into any of the non-metal metal or red elements around it. Otherwise, you're going to have to repaint the entire section. This glaze is fairly concentrated, and especially with the non-metal metal, it'll stain very quickly and you can't erase it. If you want to increase the strength of some of these orange shadows, do 1 or 2 extra passes with the gaming yellow. Just make sure that each coat is dry before you apply the next. Now, once we're done with the yellow ink glaze and it's dried on the model, we can begin to fine-tune our highlights with actual yellow, so AK yellow and pastel yellow. It looks a little glossy and shiny on the camera. That's just because the gaming yellow is a fairly satin color. It dries relatively glossy. Don't worry, once we've finished painting our highlights on top and we apply our matte varnish, it will flatten up the shine. So I've got pure AK yellow on my brush. And you can see just how close or similar this color is, like I mentioned, to that Tenere yellow with the gaming yellow glaze on top. So we're going to use that as a starting point. Just touch up some of our brightest highlights. And then we're going to mix in some pastel yellow in progressive amounts and continue to build up our highlights from there. Just be careful when you start introducing this pastel yellow, because there is white in it. The more you add, the more it's going to end up, once again, desaturating that yellow. So use it sparingly, use it on just the brightest points, and try and keep a lot of your mid and dark tones in the pastel yellow, as well as what we currently have with the ochre and glaze recipe. If you do need to go back in and do some glazes to touch up your midtones and shadows, take some Indian shadow, mix it in with the gaming yellow, and if you need to brighten up, some Sahara yellow, and that'll give you a nice glaze that you can work with to tweak some of those shadows. To prep the belt trim that's running around all around his belt, and then the 2 clasps on the buckle, we're going to be painting this in a non-metal gold. And we're going to start by blacklining it with tenebrous gray. Because we've been a little bit messy with the red and non-metal silver elements of it, I just want to go back in and neaten up all the edges, especially on the sides, with the tenebrous gray base coat. The 4-color progression on top of our tenebrous gray base coat that we're going to be doing for the non-metal gold is Vallejo Burnt Umber, English Uniform, Japanese Uniform World War II, and Ivory. Essentially, it's from sort of an earthy brown into a greenish yellow, a yellow ochre that's a little bit more on the desaturated side, and then a eggshell, sort of a yellowed off-white. The first few colors were essentially going straight from the pot. So this is the burnt umber. And we want to cover most of it. Leave the crevices, sort of any dividers in that tenuous gray. And then English uniform on top of that. And on the belt, the pieces are thin enough that we don't really have to worry about super thin or super smooth blends. Just by doing a lot of really thin brush strokes, sort of building up that color with diluted layers, we're able to essentially layer up the color very easily, very quickly. If this were sort of an armor panel or a larger surface area that's a lot flatter, you're going to want to work on building up some transition colors or intermediary steps to have a smoother transition, much like we did on the non-metal skin. And taking our pure Japanese uniform and doing the same thing. And then from Japanese uniform to ivory, it is a big jump. You're going to want to do many intermediary steps. On, again, something this thin and this tiny, you probably can get away with like 3 or 4 steps. On a larger piece, you might want to even introduce another color in between Japanese uniform and ivory to help bridge the gap, unless you're comfortable doing a lot of mixing. Now, when I get to about 50-50 Japanese uniform and ivory, I'm also going to line the bottom and the edges. Where possible, just to add a little bit of extra, I don't call it realism, but it's a little level of detail that helps to give more scale to the piece. Make it feel like the object actually has weight and depth to it. And then finally, we'll finish off with pure ivory from the top down. Just neaten up the belt buckle with some black. And we do the same recipe around the trim of the belt. And basically, you're just shifting from sort of like a mid-tone in the front. I put a bit of a highlight reflection from the clip of the belt reflecting onto the trim. I've mirrored the highlight running down from his hip down the thigh. I have a bright highlight running across. In the red as well, and to keep that consistent, I've carried that over onto the non-metal gold there. Similarly, I have a secondary highlight, a reflective highlight right here, running down the pants and extending from the back, so I've carried that onto the gold. When it gets to the back, it's a little darker. I do have a highlight running down the center of the spine into the buttocks. So you can see I'm just carrying that, keeping it consistent so that my lighting feels like it's uniform across the entire piece. We're into shadow on the back. And then on the same thing here, highlight running down the center, strongest highlight reflecting off of the belt clip. And then where the thigh curves up and angles, I put a bit of a highlight here to get some reflected light happening there as well. The belt buckle, we're using 2 colors, AK's rubber black and scale color held down flesh. Now, when we were painting the belt buckle, or the gold parts of the belt, I also base coated the X with, I use black. You can use tenuous gray if you want, something just a touch darker than the rubber black, which is actually sort of a brown-black color. On top of that, we're going to apply our base coat of rubber black. And you want to be careful not to get any of this onto the gold and the red on the inside. And then the highlight, we're just going to mix in progressive amounts of held down flesh. and work our way up to pure hellbound flesh. And then using pure hellbound flesh, we can apply some edge highlights on the top surfaces. So on this circle here, and then on the insides of the triangles. Nice and simple, and it gets a sort of almost a black metal look. We're going to be painting the Sentinel Arm in a sort of a blue color, but we want to make sure that we paint the non-metal metal underneath first before tackling the armor plates. The reason for this is because a lot of this non-metal metal is inset, it's trapped in between plates, it's underneath, and you want to be able to be not messy, but have the freedom of movement to paint the metal elements that are inset like this without worrying about overpainting onto the armor. Once we've done that silver, we can then go back in and paint the armor as normal and correct any sort of overpaints that happen. So the 4-color recipe that we're going to be using is AK's Dark Sea Blue, Gray Blue, Spectrum Blue, and Greenish White. I want to have a different metal recipe from the Colossus himself, and it matches the metal recipe that we have already used on the Sentinel head. So because the armor surfaces on the arm are much larger, we have to work on focusing our blends. We have our light source, so highlight accordingly. I've already applied a base coat of Dark Sea Blue onto the Sentinel Arm, so we can start by mixing in progressive amounts of Gray Blue. Now, I want this Sentinel Arm to have a sort of scratchy, battle damaged texture to it. So as I highlight up, I'm going to be using my brush strokes to create a lot of micro scratches and texture, very much like when we were painting the base. We're adding texture to a relatively flat surface by using our brush strokes. There's also a cheaty way to avoid having to blend everything. Now the same principle applies to painting this arm. As always with non-metal metal, consider your primary light source first. Highlight and shade the object for that, and then tackle reflected light as you go. So from Gray Blue, we're working into Spectrum Blue, and I'm highlighting less and less, focusing more of these highlights on the front. And then from Spectrum Blue, we work our way into Greenish White. Now, before I worry about any sort of highlighting on the reflective thing in the back, I have done a little bit, force of habit, I guess, with the Gray Blue and Spectrum Blue. But I'm going to take my Dark Sea Blue first, get it to a nice watercolor consistency, and I'm going to apply a glaze over the entire surface. I'll do a couple of passes, and this will help to create a nice, smoother transition into the shadow, and it'll help to bring back some of my darkest tones. And then once that's dry, I'll start looking at using gray blue and or spectrum blue to re-highlight some of the edges, particularly where I'm getting some bounce light, some reflected light. So on these edges here, it's going to be reflecting from behind as well as the trim encircling it. And then I'll take my greenish white and then just reinforce this front highlight. And we'll just carry that recipe and the technique across all of the metal elements on the Sentinel Arm. He's got a bit of a repulsor thing in the palm of the gauntlet, and I've painted that in the same color recipe as the Sentinel head on the base. So we're using that AK Amethyst Blue, scale color Sunset Purple, AK Deep Purple, and scale color Tenaire Yellow. Once we've got all of these metallic elements painted, you can see, especially on that wrist, where I've been a little sloppy with the non-metal, just sort of getting the highlights across. We're going to go back in with our dark sea blue, and we'll just neaten up the edges where the armor plates overlap. So there's a couple of prominent cables on the end that I want to paint in sort of a different texture. I want to get sort of this mesh webbing. If any of you are familiar with Gundam kits, it's a way that the cabling can essentially stretch and contract, and it's bundling all the wiring and cabling underneath. We're going to use the same color recipe as the belt, so that AK Rubber Black and scale color Hellbound Flesh. And then we're going to go back in with black and do that webbing texture. So I'm going to start with that AK Rubber Black. And then we'll just quickly create that highlight, mixing in progressive amounts of that Hellbound Flesh and working our way up. How bright you go is up to you. I'm not going to go to pure Hellbound Flesh with this first pass of highlights. I'm just going to go, let's say, 70-30 Hellbound Flesh Rubber Black. And then to create the cabling pattern, I'm just going to carefully paint a pattern of cross lines across using black. A little bit of hair stuck to my brush. So make sure your paint is nice and diluted, and you can make this mesh pattern as large or as small as you want. And we're just going to carefully paint all the way across. And once we pull it to the halfway mark along the cabling, it's already in the shadow, so we don't have to worry about wrapping all the way around. Now, because this mesh does stretch and pull as the cabling twists and turns, it's going to actually be wider along this curve and narrower here and here. Just keep that in mind when you're painting the lines. It also gives you a little bit of flexibility because the lines don't have to be equidistant. You're just implying the pattern. And then we're going to cross that pattern, go in the other direction, doing the exact same thing. And then to really sell the effect, we're going to take some of that hellbound flesh and we're going to mix it just a touch darker with rubber black. So we'll call it 80-20 or 90-10. Make sure it's nice and diluted. And then we're going to dot highlight the center cluster right here. So make sure that we stay inside the lines. So the last major part of this model is the blue armor of the Sentinel. We're going to be using 4 colors for this, aka dark sea blue as a base coat, which we've already applied beforehand and when doing the NMM model. And then we're going to highlight up through light Prussian blue, aquatic turquoise, and then a little bit of pale skin for some of the brighter highlights. I want this armor to be sort of a reflective metal, not super chrome, a bit more burnished, and then I want it to have a lot of wear and tear. It's battle damaged, it's broken. So we're not going to be concerned about necessarily having super smooth blends. So on top of the dark sea blue, I'm going to take a, let's call it a 730 mix of light Prussian blue and a dark sea blue. And I'm just going to apply a base coat, keeping some of the deepest shadows in the dark sea blue, but I want to work my way up to light Prussian blue. Keep in mind the direction of your light source. So parts of the hand especially are going to be fairly dark, and then especially on the back as well, it's going to be fairly dark because we're not getting a lot of direct light. But this portion right here, these flares where the wrist armors flare out to cover the wrist joints, and then some of these front facings are also going to be fairly bright. And from light Prussian blue, we're going to do what's called a 50-50 mix of that and aquatic turquoise. And we'll continue highlighting. Keeping my brush strokes nice and short, very scratchy. I'm looking to imply a lot of wear on the surface. And having different levels or different tones of micro scratches helps to imply a depth or a variety of depth to the battle damage. Deeper cuts are going to catch more light and so they'll be brighter. More shallow cuts aren't going to be as bright and so they'll be darker. We're going to work our way up to aquatic turquoise. And you can see I'm focusing this aquatic turquoise on this front paneling because this angles more towards the light source. When I get to these panels that aren't directly facing, I'm going to focus this color mainly on the edge. And you don't have to do a super crisp highlight on any edges either. You can sort of stipple on larger or smaller dots. You can even skip a little bit of it, and that helps to imply that that edge or that corner isn't super sharp either, but has some dings, chips, and nicks in it. And apply a highlight to the bottom where it reflects from the armor of the knuckles. And then from the quality turquoise, we're going to start mixing in pale skin. This will help keep the armor looking fairly blue, warms it up just a little bit with sort of the peachy red that's in the pale skin color, without necessarily going too green, because the quality turquoise is has green in the color. And as we get brighter and brighter with the pale skin, we're going to keep focusing on those edges. And we repeat the process over all of the blue armor. So you can see that the main focus of the blue is really on the top part of the hand, the knuckle armor, as well as the forearm armor. When you get to doing the fingers, I've found this particular sculpt very muddy. A lot of these details sort of, especially as they wrap around, blend together. So I think you need to take care as you're highlighting up to define each of the ridges. And I highly recommend looking at medieval knight armor for reference. Look at how the finger plates overlap and interlock, and sort of use that as a point of reference for how to define each of the individual armor plates. When we get to the palm of the hand, I really haven't done anything fancy to it, just 1 or 2 highlight passes and then just sort of blending it together. A lot of it is hidden in shadow, and you're really not going to see it unless you deliberately look over and inspect it. If you do want to elevate the paint job of this model, maybe you're painting it for a competition or what have you, I highly recommend keeping the hand and the Sentinel arm separate, and this will give you free access to the entire underside of the Sentinel arm to highlight and paint accordingly. It'll make it a lot easier, and then you can assemble it afterwards. I chose not to. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a final airbrush pass, more just to glaze and nuance the entire piece. So I'm using hex lichen for this from the Vallejo Game Air range, and this is a color I've used across all of my Marvel models. It's a way to introduce a common color that helps to unify the palette and basically make each model in my collection look like it belongs as one cohesive force. That, and in combination with the basing. So even if every model on top has a completely different color palette, different color combination, using these similar colors helps to introduce common themes and elements in your models. So we're going to use some hex lichen. I've got this diluted about 8 parts water to 1 part paint. Very diluted. It's a strong color, and especially on the non-metal metal, we want to avoid too much purple. So we want to make sure that any overspray is going to be nice and thin and diluted. I've got my compressor set to about 10 psi, and then we're just going to gently glaze this into the model. Using our gentle mist. So pull back on the trigger, release a bit of color, and then push forward to air dry. A little bit of color and air dry. You want to avoid any sort of pooling on the surface. And you want to make sure that you're spraying from the direction of your shadows, and this will preserve your highlights and really only get this hex lichen into your mid-tones and shadow areas. I'm going to do a few passes focusing mainly on the colored parts of the model. I'm going to avoid overspraying too much onto the metal elements. Everything's painted on the model. I'm going to apply my finishing touch. I'm going to apply some weathering powders onto the base. This is more just, again, like the hex lichen, to introduce a unifying color across all my models and then make the bases look less pristine, add a little bit of wear and tear, and just sort of that environmental sort of dusty effect happening. So I'm using a 50-50 mix of burnt umber and dark yellow ochre. These are from Vallejo Pigments. I have this mixed in a 50-50 ratio. Saved in a container because I do use it quite often. Make sure you're using an old brush for this. And I'm just going to use a little bit at a time to gently apply this to the model. I don't want to go too overboard with any individual pass. I want to slowly build up the color. Pigments are one of those things where it's very, very easy to add, very difficult to take away. So less is more. Take your time, build up the color, and really take a step back at each step and get a sense of, okay, is this too much color? Is this not enough? How do I feel about this? So as an example here on the Sentinel, I wanted to get a little bit of powder sort of just on the base, get some of the crevices, but I don't want it to really settle on the surfaces. So I'm going to use a moist brush, basically just a bit of water, wipe it off. I'm going to gently brush it across the surface, taking care not to get any of the bristles into the deepest crevices. This way it'll keep the powder in those deepest crevices, but erase it from the top surface. And once we're happy with the final application, we're going to use some mineral spirits to fix the powder to the base. So I have this loaded into a spritzer bottle, and I'm just going to liberally spray it on. Make sure it's nice and saturated, and you'll want to leave the base alone. Don't touch it, don't do anything with it. The mineral spirits will take about 45 minutes to an hour to evaporate. Once it does, the powders will be set. We're going to paint the base trim black, just using any matte black paint. I'll be using black from EK. And then we'll apply a final varnish of choice. Because this is a tabletop gaming piece for me, I need to find a varnish that doesn't alter the color too much and also protects the piece from handling during gameplay. So for personal preference, I like using Games Workshop's Purity Seal. It's a nice matte varnish without being too flat, and I found it robust enough over years of use to not really wear off from lots of handling. Now, Purity Seal is no longer in production. Games Workshop does have a newer line called the Minotaurum Spray. I found that one to be a little bit more satin than Purity Seal, so I would stay away from it personally. I know a lot of people will stand by Tesper's Dull Coat, and I found that one a little too matte. The company, I think Rust-Oleum, is the parent company for Tesper's, has also discontinued the Dull Coat brand, so you won't really be able to find that in the open market apart from what's left. There is another brand by Mr. Hobby called Super Clear, which is very, very equivalent to Tesper's, but slightly less matte. I think if you were to have Tesper's Dull Coat on one end and Purity Seal on the other, Super Clear is somewhere in between. So it's a nice alternative, depending on what your personal preference is. But for gaming piece, you want to varnish it. If this is mainly for display or a collection where you're not going to be handling a lot, you can actually probably avoid applying any varnish of choice, and that way your colors will be as they are, as natural as possible. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more awesome weekly content. And don't forget to check out my other video series, both for this model as well as others I've uploaded to my YouTube channel. As always, until next time, happy hobbying.